talking to a student who's in our program, and she was just talking about a student who used a wheelchair, and that the administrator didn't want her to have a TA to help her push the wheelchair because she has brittle bone syndrome.
Because they needed someone specially trained.
No, they just didn't have
the extra staff
to do it.
So then what was their solution?
She walks around and breaks a bone.
Welcome to Curious and Unqualified, a podcast about life in academia. I'm Eric Edlund, professor of physics.
And I'm Jeremy Jimenez, professor in the Foundations and Social Advocacy Department. And from this same department, we'd like to welcome my colleague and friend, Dr. Carrie Rood, who is here to tell us more about some of the things happening now with the Trump administration with regards to what is referred to as special education. So welcome, Carrie.
Well, thank you for having me.
One of the major things happening now with the Trump administration is the gutting of the Department of Education. What do you understand to have been, until recently, the key functions of our Department of Education?
So as you probably both know, the department is pretty new, right? For about 40 years it's been around. And a lot of it has evolved over time, but originally it was around oversight and making sure that states were in compliance in terms of following lots of different regulations and rules. And more recently, it's been about considering research in education and bringing that to classrooms, as well as funding research to support best practices. So, for example, everyone knows about the science of reading, I would assume, right? Maybe not?
A little bit. I've heard of phonics. Does that count?
It is. It's like it's similar to that in terms of phonics. But a few years ago, there had been an expose by a reporter that we had been using these bad science in terms of teaching reading, and the department had funded for a long time research on better practices, which had to do with phonological awareness as well as phonetics, etc. And the department itself funded a lot of the grant research to make sure that that kind of research around reading was actually happening inside schools.
And what do you what do you foresee to be the future consequences of this? So how has it been cut, and what are the consequences for stakeholders, children, parents, teachers, society of these cuts?
Well, there's been a lot of cuts. About more than half of the staff who've worked in the Department of Education have been cut since March of 2025. So that has really big consequences in terms of if these laws are being followed, if people are in compliance, if they're out of compliance, what are the steps that people can take to file suit with, for example, the Office of Civil Rights, if there was some type of discrimination, as well as opportunities for more research to get good practices into schools that we know work. So I feel like it will be really dire. My area of expertise is in special education, so parents really rely on OSERS, or the Office of Special Education, which is housed inside the Department of Education, for a lot of resources, as well as supports in terms of disseminating the law and making sure that people are remaining in compliance with the law.
So while we're on that, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background in inclusive education and your kind of understanding of the field more generally.
So I'll start farther back. So when I was a teacher, I got certified in special education and social studies. And I tell my students this, I teach at SUNY Cortland, mostly around inclusive education, that I had to take 2 classes to get certified in special education, which is wild to me that I could take 2 classes and I could be certified in something, as well as some exams, etc. But this was back in 2006. So when I was teaching, I taught mostly actually in segregated spaces. And it was really disheartening to me to see the ways that people were talking about treating students with disabilities. And when I say segregated, that means students in a separate location. They're not integrated with the general education class. And it was mostly students with emotional and behavioral disabilities. And I didn't really understand why this felt so wrong, or why it didn't really feel right to me that we were treating students in this way. And I decided to take a class It was called Social Policy and Disability. It was a foundations class in education, and it was about disability studies, which is this idea of thinking about disability differently. So instead of considering that people are disabled, considering how society is disabling. That's like the really basic kind of premise of it. It's a little bit deeper than that, but that's the basic premise.
Meaning that as a society, we should be looking to enable people rather than disable them? Like, it's kind of an institutional
Yeah, so like thinking about, for example, if you think about physical environment, right? If you're at SUNY Cortland, for example, we have this building, Old Main. There is one accessible entrance. When that building was built, right, they're thinking about, okay, people who use wheelchairs, who have mobility impairments, are not going to need to access this environment. The stairs are what make it so people can't get in the building. Not that the people can't actually be part of that space. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. Right. I mean, so they were very much going for the aesthetic of the old pillared building, right?
Yeah.
Rather than thinking about making a space that worked for everyone.
Exactly. So that structural decision made it so people with disabilities weren't able to access it, or at least those with physical and mobility impairments. So that space was disabling, not that the person is actually disabled. So if the stairs weren't there, the ramp wasn't there, they'd be able to access that no problem.
Yeah, you thought it was surprising that you only had to take 2 courses to get certified. And I think it's surprising that when I got my education certification, I didn't have to take any. Like, it was not considered something that, it was not a single required course or workshop or anything, to be certified in the state of New Jersey in the early aughts. And similarly, about the segregation, when I went back to be a sub in my high school where I graduated, I got a memo. It was like, oh, go to the B wing. And I was like, what's the B wing? Like, the B wing, got to go there. I was like, and they described like going past the kind of like maintenance areas, like down to like a dark hallway. Like, it's a wing of the school I didn't even know existed. And I found that that's actually where they put all the special educations. And generally my school is very under-resourced, but that area was particularly under-resourced. And it was so shocking to me that a whole wing of it was so segregated, a whole wing of my school I wasn't even aware of for 4 years. And I was like kind of one of those Saved by the Bell kids by the 4th year, right? Like, I was very active in school. So like, I couldn't believe I didn't even know that area existed, but that's how segregated it was.
Also, Saved by the Bell?
Well, that's my go-to. Is like, because those kids like do everything, like they're on the football team.
But I hadn't even thought about it in that way, Saved by the Bell. Like, that's what is happening. Why?
Oh, well, let's bring a Saved by the Bell.
Were you more of a Zach or a Slater?
Neither. Come on, Screech.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of sad. I don't know if he died or something. I don't know. Yeah, Screech died. Yeah, I don't know if it was some kind of tragic circumstances like suicide or drug something. But yeah, it was because like almost everyone else in that series moved on, but Screech never he was always just Saved by the Bell.
Kind of typecast for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
So going back to your question, right? So whatever. I took this class while I was teaching, and it taught me about disability studies, and it really made me understand. Okay, this is why I'm thinking that these kids have very little opportunities, that there's low expectations. It's because this is how society has been built. Like, disability isn't seen as something valuable. It's seen as something that's negative, something that's not meaningful, something that's not an identity. And I wanted to pursue that more, so I decided to get my PhD in inclusive ed and special education with a focus on disability studies, because I really wanted to translate that to other people who are learning how to teach. Like, society is perceiving disability in this way and creating these barriers that continue to push people out and lower opportunities for people with disabilities.
Can I ask you maybe a very specific question about a situation that I heard about recently, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this. And I guess in the more contemporary thinking, we want to try to be more inclusive, bring students with disabilities, learning disabilities, socio-emotional learning issues, bring them into the classroom with other students. The flip side of that, though, is that those students can be very disruptive to the normal progression of a class. And I heard about a family here in Cortland who has some students in, I think it was like a 4th grade class. And almost every day they had to take all of the class out in the hallway, and they had to line out there, sit out in the hallway and wait for some period of 5 or 10 minutes for one student in the class to kind of calm down and get out of their state. And so it seems like it's on one hand, it's good to think about being more inclusive, but that comes with a cost under some circumstances. So how do you balance these two issues or perspectives?
I think the challenge is that schools are often doing inclusion poorly, right? And we're saying we're doing it, but we're just doing it. We're not doing it well. So like when you're truly doing inclusion and you're doing it well, I'm thinking about this situation in particular, there would be supports that were part of the classroom that would be available for that student, embedded in some way as well. Their behavior is obviously a reaction to something or is communicating something for them. So you would, in these instances, try to get at the root of what that behavior is. And I get it can be disruptive, right? But then also, what about the education of that child? Are you also discounting their education?
I get that, but on the other hand, then you might be somewhat discounting the education of 30 students for the one in this situation.
But that's like an old.
So I'm old school thought.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, it's an old school thought, but it's in like an old way to kind of push against inclusion, because it's like, whose classroom is this? Who's going to benefit? Who is this fair to? Is this giving an unfair advantage to like whomever or whatever students? So I would say, again, in part because of how we're doing inclusion we're not doing it well.
And it sounds like part of the issue here then is a matter of resources, which is a perpetual issue in education, right? And so, if you had the staffing and you could have someone there to support the student.
Or even like if you have the staffing in terms of like planning for the student. So if there was really intentional planning with the teachers for the student, which maybe there is.
Yeah, and I'm sure you could argue it's both an issue of knowing what is good inclusive policy and practice and the resources, but like, which do you think is the bigger obstacle? You think is like if schools were allocated more money, they would be able to do better things, or is it having these outdated mindsets where like a lot of schools might have a lot of money, but they're just not actually using it for positive inclusive practice?
I think it's both, really. I think mindset is definitely the first spot that you have to go when you're thinking about how to include people with disabilities or disabled people. But then it's also thinking about how are you using the resources, how is the leadership considering the value of the students in the school and what that might look like.
What I was thinking when you were saying that is like thinking about how many resources we put towards things like sports programs in school, right? So it really is a matter of choice.
But some of it is also like funding, like in terms of resources in schools. Like we were just in a meeting today, Jeremy and I, where people are talking about teachers being really tapped out because they're being asked to do too much. Right? And I think the work of teaching has really changed in good and bad ways, right? There is more of a focus on data and thinking deeply about using data in intentional ways. But also at the same time, we're asking teachers to be therapists. We're asking teachers to like be the place where there's food security available for students. We're asking teachers to
differentiate their instruction.
Yeah, right?
And the age-old practice of being, in some sense, a disciplinarian, right? I mean, you have to still keep order in a classroom.
Classroom management, right, for sure.
And those issues are also, at least in some aspects, I think, getting worse in time. At least there's a public perception that they are, at least.
Is it because of the culture that we're having in schools at the moment? Is it something about the kids? Or is it something about how we're thinking school should work? Like, is it contextualized? Are we just trying to get through information? Are we trying to actually teach students how to learn?
So in thinking of resources, one of the legal frameworks to help ensure that there are some resources is the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And so I was wondering if you could talk about, for listeners who don't know, what is the Individuals with Disabilities Act? What has been its successes in your view? And where, if relevant, has it fallen short?
Well, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, was started in 1975 in November, which is 50 years from today, from this time period. And so its real goal was to ramify lots of challenges that had occurred for families and children with disabilities. So before 1975, there was no comprehensive law across the United States that you had to educate students with disabilities. So students were often either under-resourced, so they were put in back corner in classrooms, not taught anything, or put in institutions. And I'd recommend, if you are not sure what institutions are like or what they were like, to watch Willowbrook. You can look it up. It's very horrifying, but it's basically putting kids in spaces where there was no education going on. So the law itself was trying to ramify this. It was trying to find ways to get rid of some of these atrocities that had happened to kids with disabilities and families with disabilities, to support access. And it was really a civil rights legislation. So how do we make sure that kids with disabilities are not just going to be turned away? Like, everyone has seen Forrest Gump, right? Or most people have seen Forrest Gump. You can remember the scene, right? You can remember the scene where they're talking with the principal, and he's like, Forrest is right here. He's not going to be able to attend this school. He's going to have to go to a special school. So, like, that was a really routine experience for families, as their kids were denied access to education. So it's done a lot in terms of making sure that we have excuse me, this legal framework for parents and families and kids to have access to education. It's changed over the last 4 years. So it's a law that is, it's not static, right? It changes as the needs are up. Like one of the things that the big changes it made was in 1997, they noticed that there was really huge discrepancies between students with disabilities progress post-secondary and students without disability. So they added in provisions that when you were planning to support students after they leave high school, it's not like, okay, we're done after K-12. We have to really think about how do we bridge that, so for kids who are going to college, kids who are going to employment, whatever it might mean, that they're going to be more successful. And the Department of Education actually collected data since, I think it was 2004, on the success of students transitioning from high school to post-secondary. And that is also going to be taking away the data set and the collection. It's been like just starting to really get us some ideas of like, okay, what's been really successful in the last 20 years to support students.
So to clarify, what you're talking about here is what high schools should be doing to help their students while they're in high school plan for life.
High schools should be doing to help their students while they're in high school plan for life.
Yes.
What if someone were to say like, well, this is really
100%.
terrible what's happening at the federal level, but at the state level, it's going the other direction. Now, according to the whole SUNY system, there's a push to, within a few months, have all of our documents accessible online. So what if someone were to say like, well, if you're from a blue state and the blue state still believes in these values, who cares what happens with the federal government? We have these blue state protections. How would you respond to that?
What you're referencing is actually Title II, which is a federal law that's under the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So even if you were a blue state, you would, or a red state, we're a blue state, you would have to also follow that. But without the Department of Education, ADA is not under the Department of Education, but without laws like that, then there's a fear by many families, parents, advocates that there will be no follow-up when people are not in compliance. And right now the states are actually in control of and supposed to be, the ones who are running in terms of special education within the state as well as local educational agencies. But there's been so many complaints that states aren't following through. And what the federal government does in the Department of Ed in particular is they have oversight and they follow up to see if the states are in compliance with the law and what they're reporting.
Which is a more maybe proactive way of going about it. Like the kind of unactive or passive way to deal with that would be just to let the courts settle this and lawsuits arise from individuals or agencies and then have it, settled through the legal system, which is, from my understanding, I think is a little bit why New York State is being so proactive right now, is that there's been a couple high-profile legal cases that have kind of scared the SUNY system into the
In terms of Title II, yes. There have been a few, and that was before, it was in 1998, 2018, we're back in time, 2018, where there was more than one across SUNY, and it was actually, I think it was New Paltz, where they were dinged, and then SUNY had to change everything.
And so with the cuts, has there been some kind of backlog now of cases that are not being addressed?
There had been of about 20,000. Right now there are about 25,000 backlog cases in terms of.
These are cases brought by individuals?
Yes, around discrimination, not just around disability though.
Yeah.
So it's in the Office of Civil Rights.
Okay.
So the highest number is for around sex discrimination, but the next is disability.
And do you know how these cases are settled within the Department of Ed? What is the process there?
So they investigate it. They have like people who work there, which right now there's very few people who work there. Actually, I heard a statistic that it was maybe one person was going to have to look at 178 cases. So that usually takes years to go over one or two cases because you have to go and investigate, see what happened, see what the state had done or not done with the school district. So there's no way that anything is probably going to happen.
And what have been the staffing cuts at the Department of Ed?
What do you mean?
Oh, the Department of Ed has certain staff that were cut, right?
So across.
What's the numbers? Like, what was it like in the
I think it was 4,500, and now it was 2,500 as late as October, and then they did another, I think it was 500, so it's about 2,000 people now.
So less than half of
Yeah.
what it was.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
It's in one of the things in terms of the Office of Special Education, which again is housed in the Department of Ed. is they fund these things called parent technical assistance centers. And what these do is they help parents and families understand what their rights are, what to do if they disagree with a school district, what are the kind of opportunities for advocates to come with you and support you in these spaces. And one of the reasons why they have this is because no one knows about special education unless you know you have a child or you know someone who's received services in some way. It's not like when you become a parent, it's like, oh, I'm going to have a kid with a disability, right? It's typically not the desired outcome, right? You're not assuming you're not considering that that's what is going to happen, right? So it's like a whole different world you have to go into to understand what your rights are, what your child's rights are.
I have a very small glimpse into this. My son has a kind of a minor medical accommodation at school.
504?
529, I think it is.
Okay. I don't know, 529.
Or maybe I'm mixing up my numbers. It could be
529, I think it's a savings account.
Oh, that is. I have a 529 for my son.
I
Yes.
think it might be a 504.
504. Yeah. We got one established about 2 years ago. And it hasn't really impacted his life very much. It hasn't been important. But what was interesting initially was how there wasn't exactly direct resistance to it, but you could tell that the school was kind of dragging their feet on implementing this, because every implementation of one of these plans is resources, and in resource-strapped schools, which they all are to one extent, even in a very well-funded school like he's at over in Ithaca, you can tell like they still try not to dedicate resources to these things, and I get that tension, right? Yeah. Because maybe especially for like these more minor kind of fringe cases, in the sense that like, I mean, you have so much money that's given to you by the county or whatever school district you're in, and you get to divide that up in different ways, right? And so you might have some kids that have high needs and some kids that have low needs, and then you have your kind of your standard students without any accommodations, right? And so I guess from an administrative perspective, like I get that tension. Like you probably really want and need to put the resources towards the really high need students.
Yes, but 504 is a different law, right? So, and there's a difference between special education and disability in terms of school. So I don't know if you want me to go into a long spiel about what the differences are, because it's...
Well, we probably don't have time for that, but maybe you could give like a 1 minute summary. Pitch. Yeah.
Okay. Oh my God. 1 minute elevator pitch. 504 is a lovely law that supports kids whose disability doesn't adversely affect their educational performance, right? And there's specific criteria about what it means to adversely affect the educational performance. But with 504, there's less oversight. So with special education, because it is more detailed, there's more legislation, more requirements. If people are out of compliance with it, there's like clear steps in what you can do in terms of helping to get back in compliance, or to help show that they were out of compliance and discriminating against you.
And probably also greater latitude for families to sue schools
if they're not.
Yes, and 504 is again, it's a great law. It follows people their whole lives, right? Special education is only for PK through 21, but there are definitely less opportunities if schools are not following it to have any type of recourse.
I think it's interesting that if this is happening in a school with more resources than other schools, and that has very much a district known for having social justice missions, like if you're finding this in those districts, you can imagine, how dire the situation could be in other districts.
I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking. Imagine like you're in a underfunded urban school or a rural school. Yeah, so there's a knowledge issue there, but also, I mean, administrators are going to be up kind of against the wall trying to make things work
better. Yeah, and I was just talking to a student who's in our program, and she was just talking about a student who used a wheelchair, and that the administrator didn't want her to have a TA to help her push the wheelchair because she has brittle bone syndrome, because they didn't have a teacher that was able to push her.
Because they needed someone specially trained.
No, they just didn't have
the extra staff
to do it. So they didn't want her to use the wheelchair because they didn't want to have someone to have to push her around because she couldn't physically do it.
And so then what was their solution?
She walks around and breaks a bone.
Wow.
That does not sound like a good solution.
Doesn't sound like a good solution. But like, this is the problem. If we don't have these laws, if they're not being, if there's no compliance with them,
That it's very easy for districts to decide to.
oh, I'm not going to do this. It's too expensive.
Yeah.
But like, the law itself is a beautiful law. The spirit of it is to create these opportunities for students to ramify all these terrible things that we had done for so long for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I see a lot of positive things in another school I'm visiting, and but what I noticed, a lot of positive things, there are a lot of staff members in those classrooms, right? And so you see such a difference between, there's always the role of teacher dedication, but like the additional staff members in the class really make the difference for the teacher to be able to actually do those things. So one thing, a documentary I just showed my international education class is called Life of Ibelin, and it's about a Norwegian teenager, then adult, who has Duchenne, which is basically a very serious form of muscular dystrophy, and almost everyone has it, dies fairly young. But without giving away too much there, I suggest you all watch. It's great. It's a great movie. Is he has this technology which allows him to play video games and kind of interact with people around the world with these video games, and it's really wonderful to see the affordances of that technology. Putting on my environmental hat, though, and my energy hat, I know that a lot of the equipment and modifications being used are wonderful, but I also know their days are numbered, because a lot of the mineral inputs for a lot of these technological devices, they're in short supply and they're eventually going to run out. And there's also just the issue of the electricity to power them might become less available over time. So my concern is that there could be dependencies built into these technologies, that what happens decades from now when these technologies are no longer there. So I guess, like, how would you think about that issue, about these technologies being so wonderful now, but if you read the energy environmental impact, you understand their days might be numbered. How should we think about that?
I think it's challenging in part because you went mineral. What did you say?
Mineral inputs, like the average laptop has 60 something minerals.
Those are the tools that people are using to access the environment. So like, if someone is using a computer, particularly if someone isn't able to speak or communicate verbally, then that's their way of accessing the environment. It's the same thing with a wheelchair, right? It's not like the wheelchair itself is how they're entering the world, how they're part of the socialization. And I feel like it would be challenging, particularly for people who use this technology, whether it's like a laptop or a wheelchair or an iPad or device or it might be, to not have those. Because when I see that happening today, like, for example, I was in a school and a girl doesn't have reliable communication. Like, she's not able to actually be in the classroom in a real meaningful way. So I don't know what the answer is, but I hope that we're thinking about and prioritizing, which I'm sure we probably are not as a society, right? Those needs, if those are like the basic ways in which people can be part of the social world.
Yeah, my own way of thinking of it is, when you think of, you have a fossil fuel budget, right? Or there's only a certain amount of resources we should use to keep our planet habitable for complex life. So much is being invested in AI, right? And often to make people's lives easier or to be able to access things. Like, it's how we have a limited access to these energy technology resources. And even if it's true their days are numbered in the future, we could be better allocating it now while we have access to technology.
Which we won't do, right?
Yeah, especially in the current
Yeah,
climate.
we won't do.
So here's a question I've always been curious about. Students and families suffered a lot during COVID when people were locked at home. And I always thought that families with special needs kids probably suffered far more than others because, well, all of a sudden you don't have those extra aids. You have no aids, right? Parents are thrust into this role to become special ed experts while managing their careers at home. Do you have any sense of how families like that fared during COVID?
Yeah, so actually, did a study on the impact of COVID on families in terms of collaboration with schools, and many of the families had discussed that it was a big shift, right, in terms of prioritizing their kids and their education. I think that's true for everyone. Some of the shifts were in part like using technology to do, for example, related service like OT, having things dropped off to the family and then them actually doing the occupational therapy with their child as opposed to having someone do that with them. There's a lot of research that says when you have a child with a disability, the stress level is much higher. Actually, a lot of families get divorced.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Have a child with a disability. And in part, it goes back to this idea I was talking about before about that the society really isn't made for people with disabilities, right? So the resources, if we were really thinking about how this might look more equitably, we might prioritize the resources and what that might look like for people with disabilities. But we don't do that. So COVID is another example of that. Everyone was really struggling, correct?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And we saw that students' abilities plummeted during that time, and I imagine even more so, probably twice as much, right? Students with I don't know.
I don't know. I don't have a data point.
Okay.
But I could say families definitely struggled in terms of meeting the needs of their children. And a lot of the services that stopped, right, there was probably significant progress for some families. Like I talked to a family actually in Ithaca who had multiple kids with disabilities, and they had a child who, oh my gosh, this was like 3 years ago, so give me a second to remember. I think she had a mobility impairment and she had been really working on some fine motor skills and had lost a lot of that over the course of time, particularly because services weren't really being provided oftentimes in COVID.
Oh, I could totally imagine that. I mean, especially if you have parents who are working, 2 jobs, right? Or each parent working a job. You have very limited time to interface with your children. I imagine many children just got plunked down with an iPad or whatever, and it was back to TV time.
Right.
Yeah.
So especially students that need some sort of motor skill development, occupational therapy, things like that. That
Probably.
And I think a lot of people banded together, right, to try to figure out ways to do it creatively. But as all of us know, like it took months to figure anything out. Even at SUNY Cortland, right, we had this really weird semester where we thought we were going to come back after 2 weeks, and then we didn't, and we had to adjust and figure out what that would look like and how our classes would be different.
It was a terrible. The hybrid thing was a total disaster, right? Yeah.
And I think even with my own daughter, like I was doing the best that I could. I was not doing good on either front as being a faculty member or being a parent or the way that I would like to have liked it to be.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of support, and she doesn't have a disability.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about the impacts of cuts, but also there's in many ways an ideological shift with the current administration. So I was wondering, like one example that I admit it's mostly for me seeing the headlines is RFK and his commentary on autism. So I was wondering if you could comment on specifically what is so problematic, as I imagine you find it problematic, what he says about it. And do you think it is just kind of more of a headline grasping thing, or there's actually going to be deep, lasting consequences to the views that he espouses?
If we're thinking broadly, I definitely think that there's going to be lasting impacts in terms of vaccine schedules and kids getting vaccines. We know, right, and this is not an area of expertise, but we know that there have been more outbreaks of particular things like measles. I do think that's going to have an impact in terms of people's fear of vaccines continuing, and I don't believe in acetaminophen causes autism, right? Like science proves that that's not true. I do think it's going to have impacts, and if we so the plan is to only keep the Office of Special Education and to put it in HHS, that's RFK. It's going to go back to thinking about not educationally how we support students with disabilities, but instead thinking medically how do we fix them.
Yeah, and to elaborate a little bit what you mean, especially in the case of autism.
Elaborate.
Like, so that he will say, like, the problem is kids have autism and thus they're ruined. Like, this whole idea that, like, and so I wonder if you could push back on that statement.
I I might say, again, ideologically, we differ in thinking about many people who identify as autistic would say they're autistic. There's autistic self-advocacy networks that talk about that this is a part of my identity. This is who I am. I'm not ruined. I would not be the same person I am if I didn't have autism. So if people could accept that and think about how do you make sure that I have a sense of belonging and community as a person with autism and not say that there's something wrong with me and try to fix me.
So you told us a little bit about your recent study. What other research are you currently working on, or other publications you recently, like, what are some of the other things that have interested you and you've studied?
Yeah, this is going to be super liberal. So, so when I was doing the study, I interviewed this guy, and he had a daughter who has a disability. They're downstate, closer to New York City, and he had gone to New York City schools himself. And he went to something called 600 schools, which is an earlier iteration of District 75, which if you're familiar with the New York City schools, it's like the segregated district for kids with disabilities. Like if you have disability, you're District 75, even if you're integrated into a school or something. So I'd never heard of this, 600 schools. So I'm in the midst of it still. I just have very little time with 2 small children to go to New York City and do this. But I want to go into the archives and look at the research about the 600 schools, see what had occurred, how they kind of thought about this more segregated space before. And in part because what he said to me when I was interviewing him is that because of his experience in these 600 schools, he didn't think he could learn until he was 35. And now he has a PhD. And he's very fearful that his daughter, who's going through this process, will also begin to believe that she is unable to learn. And this will perpetuate this cycle of special education or being labeled as disabled, as perpetuating this like inability to learn, this lack of opportunity, this disbelief in oneself. So I found it really, oh my gosh, interesting isn't the word. Really
Insightful?
Not insightful. It's like, I'll just say impactful. It was very impactful for me in considering like these legacies, oh my gosh, cycles of special education and its impact on families.
So, okay, 2 last questions for you, for me at least. First one, are you a fan of traditional letter grade assessment?
No.
Okay.
Would you be willing to entertain my next question and give our education system as a whole a letter grade, especially in regards to special or inclusive education? How are we doing?
I think it's so dependent on the district. That's the challenge right now, and I don't know which scholar talked about that. Where you grow up, the zip code impacts the type of school that you have. So I can go into a really well-resourced school, and I'm like, wow, this is working really well. There's just a few things that I might change. Or I can go to an under-resourced school, and I'm like, I see such good intention. I see people are really trying, but there's some systematic things that are not working.
So if you were parachuted into the median school, what grade would that school get?
I really envision schools to look very different than they are. I would say C.
So we're passing, but we're not thriving.
I don't know if we're even, I would say maybe C minus.
Okay, we're a generous C minus.
Or whatever an E means in our school. Whatever that's supposed to mean.
Yeah. Ooh.
All right, so a reluctant pass.
Yeah,
Okay.
reluctant.
Yeah.
They could be so much better. They could be so awesome. They could be so amazing for
Well,
so many students.
that might be a
Conversation for another time to kind of talk about what the vision of an ideal school would look like, or what it looks like to you.
Ooh, maybe like a utopia panel.
Yeah, utopia in education.
That would be cool. Yeah, we have a lot of people on for that.
That's all for me.
Okay. Well, yeah, I know, Carrie, as a busy working mother, we know you're juggling a lot of responsibilities, so we appreciate you fitting us into a time slot to have this very interesting and worthwhile conversation. So thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you.
Thank you,
This is
Carrie.
terrible.